This is Counterpoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Allen. Although medical assistance in dying, or MAID, was legalized in 2016, the debate surrounding the morality and ethics of this life ending practice hasn't gone away. Many see MAID as a means to end their suffering or to speed up their inevitable death. But others counter that MAID offers a false sense of compassion and a diminishment of the suffering experience. But is there actual value in suffering? Why should someone with a terminal illness carry on with life knowing that death is just around the corner? Does MAID devalue human life and encourage those fighting illnesses just to give up? Well, joining me now to unpack the ethics of MAID and the meaning of suffering is Amanda Achtman. Amanda is a Next Gen Fellow at Cardis and a 2023 to 2024 Krauthammer Fellow at the Tikva Fund. She works with the Canadian Physicians for Life on ethics education and cultural engagement, and she is the founder of the Dying to Meet You project. Amanda, thank you so much for joining me today to share your project with us all.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start right there. What is the Dying to Meet You project?
Well, a few years ago, I was working in the office of a member of parliament as we sought to prevent the legislative expansion of euthanasia, or medical aid in dying, as it's known in Canada, to those with disabilities and for whom a mental illness is their sole underlying condition. As you mentioned, euthanasia was legalized in 2016, and not even a few years later, already the government was eroding the safeguards that had been deemed essential just a few years prior. And so I was working in the office of this member of parliament. We were trying to raise up the voices of persons with disabilities, Indigenous groups, palliative care doctors, who were sounding the alarm about the devaluing of life. And yet, I realized that this law was going to pass. It was somewhat of a foregone conclusion. And I started to think, how can I take personal responsibility for the fact that in Canada, we don't even so much have a culture of death, as I seem to think that we actually have death without culture. We've lost the cultural tenor around death and dying in our society. And that's why on January 1st, 2021, while I was still doing my work as a political staffer, I made a personal resolution to blog about death and dying every single day for that year of 2021. And my blog was called Dying to Meet You. I was blogging at dyingtomeetyou.ca. Now my website and new project, kind of 2.0 version, is at dyingtomeetyou.com. But really it all started as my own catharsis of contending with these topics personally. And I tried to take basically orient myself toward a hopeful contending with the mystery of suffering, death, meaning, and hope through this year-long blogging project, which has now morphed into a much wider cultural project that involves a mix of videos, speaking, writing, and community events.
And it's kind of interesting that you kind of, in some very quiet way, kind of force us to deal with these topics, because with death, nobody likes talking about death. It's, a fearful, maybe terrible idea to think about or talk about or plan your funeral. I have no issues talking about death, but some people I find really, really wrestle with that. So you're kind of forcing us to talk about death and suffering. And that's not very common for, say young women in Canada. But, this really seems to have morphed into almost like a passion project for you. Where does that passion come from?
Oh, there are many things. I will say that as soon as I started blogging about death every day, I started to question myself. What have I gotten myself into? It was even day 3, and I thought, am I really going to honor this commitment for the entire year? Which, to my amazement, I actually did. But what gave it so much life and what motivated me to do it was still the midst of the pandemic, and having to write the blog each day helped me to go out of myself, to interview people about their stories, even to ask friends and family, tell me about a death in your family. And every time I did that, people had a story they wanted to share, and they appreciated the opening. And for me, as a young person, in the midst of the pandemic, travel bans, the discouragement of that time, this was what actually broadened my own horizon of transcendence, took me out of myself, and gave me something to be interested in that was not just my own sort of imminent sense of life. So honestly, that's just one spark. There are many other underlying motivations that I could point to, but first and foremost, I'll say it's so fascinating how many people appreciate the opening to talk about suffering and death,
Right.
because you're right, it seems like there isn't space for it, and yet we all have these experiences, and so too we have the yearning to share them with one another.
Okay, Amanda, we're going to cut to commercial. We'll be right back.